whispers in the walls. In a forgotten village nestled deep within the woods stood an ancient house, older than anyone could remember. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone dared to tell. The locals whispered that it was cursed, haunted by something older than the house itself. Most steered clear, but one autumn night, a man named Peter arrived from the city, intrigued by the stories. He didn't believe in ghosts. To him, the house was just a decaying structure, waiting to be explored. Peter entered the house as dusk settled. The air inside was thick, musty, with a strange sense of stillness that unsettled him. The wallpaper peeled like skin, and the floorboards groaned under his weight, as if the house was waking up after a long slumber. He began his exploration, shining his flashlight across the crumbling furniture and faded paintings that still clung to the walls. The house seemed ordinary enough, just old and neglected. But as he wandered deeper, something strange began to happen. It was faint at first, soft murmurs barely audible. He stopped, straining to listen. It sounded like whispers, but there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, as if they were coming from the very walls. Peter felt a chill creep up his spine. He shook it off, convincing himself it was just the wind, perhaps seeping through cracks in the old stone. But the voices didn't stop. They seemed to follow him, growing more insistent with every step he took. He reached the second floor, where the air was heavier, oppressive. The whispers were clearer now, many voices speaking at once, too fast to understand. Peter's pulse quickened, but he pressed on, determined to prove the stories wrong. He entered what seemed to be a bedroom. The wallpaper here was covered in strange, erratic scratches, as if someone had clawed at the walls in desperation. As Peter ran his hand over the marks, the whispers surged, louder than ever. This time, he understood a single word. Leave. Peter froze. The voices were angry now, rising into a cacophony, all demanding the same thing. Leave! They screamed, filling the room, surrounding him from all sides. His flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Peter stumbled back toward the door, his heart racing. And then, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Peter lunged for it, his hand shaking as he tried to twist the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers became screams, echoing through his mind, relentless and piercing. He pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the house swallowed his cries, the darkness closing in. Suddenly, the walls began to move. The scratched wallpaper seemed to ripple, like something was crawling beneath the surface. Faces pressed against the fabric, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes empty pits of darkness. Peter backed away, trapped, as the faces pushed through the walls, closer and closer. The last thing he heard before the lights went out was a voice, soft, cold, and final. You should have listened. When the villagers found the house the next morning, it was silent, empty. But if you stand close enough to the walls, they say you can still hear Peter's screams, forever trapped. Another voice among the whispers. The watcher in the window. They say that sometimes when you stare out into the darkness, something stares back. Claire didn't believe in superstitions, but that changed the night she moved into the old house on Alder Lane, a place the locals whispered about but never explained. It was an old Victorian house, large and isolated, surrounded by dead trees and a sense of quiet that felt too heavy. Perfect for Claire, who was tired of city life. She saw the house as a peaceful escape, but peace is the last thing she found. On her first night, Claire set up her new room, glancing occasionally out of her window, which offered a view of the overgrown garden and the shadowy forest beyond. The setting sun cast long shadows, making everything feel cold and distant. That's when she noticed it. A figure, tall, impossibly thin, standing at the edge of the tree line. Its shape was barely human, a silhouette darker than the twilight sky. Claire blinked and shook her head. It was probably just a trick of the light, she told herself. She closed the curtains, locked her door, and went to bed, convincing herself that it was nothing. But the feeling of being watched lingered. The next night, she couldn't resist. She peeked out the window again, and there it was, closer this time, standing perfectly still, facing the house. A shiver ran down her spine. Its head was slightly tilted, as though it was studying her. Claire quickly closed the curtain, her heart pounding. She decided to ignore it, pushing the fear aside. But as the days passed, the figure inched closer to the house. Every night, when she dared to look, it was a few feet nearer, always still, always silent. By the third night, it was at the edge of the garden, almost at the house. Claire's sleep became restless, the fear gnawing at her, but she tried to rationalize it. It's just a shadow. It can't be real. She tried to convince herself, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. On the fourth night, as she lay in bed, Claire heard it. A soft, rhythmic tap. It started slow, barely noticeable, like fingers drumming on wood. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Dread filled her chest as she sat up, heart racing. The sound continued, steady and deliberate. She didn't want to look, but the compulsion was too strong. Trembling, she pulled back the curtain and screamed. The figure was right outside the window, its face pressed against the glass. Except it wasn't a face. There were no eyes, no features, just a blank, pale surface where a face should be. The tapping was coming from one long, skeletal hand, its fingers tapping rhythmically on the window, like it was waiting to be let in. Claire stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She grabbed her phone, trying to call for help, but the screen was dead, a black mirror reflecting the horror before her. The tapping stopped. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head again, its blank face seeming to stretch into a grotesque mockery of a grin, though it had no mouth. Slowly, it raised one hand and pointed toward the front door. Claire's blood ran cold. She backed away, heart pounding in her throat. She heard it then, the soft creak of the front door opening, the unmistakable sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps entering the house. She ran to the door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She managed to throw it open and ran down the stairs, her breath ragged, heart racing. The house felt too dark, too still. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing through the hallway. Desperate, Claire dashed toward the front door, but as she reached it, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door was wide open, swinging slowly in the wind, but beyond it stood the figure. It was inside now, towering over her, the featureless face just inches from hers. There was no escape. Her scream filled the night, but no one heard. The next morning the house stood silent, empty. The locals would later say that no one had lived in that house for years, not since the last resident vanished without a trace. The garden overgrew, the windows collected dust, and the door remained firmly shut. But if you stand close enough, some swear they can hear a soft tapping on the upstairs window. Others claim to see a figure standing in the garden at night, waiting, watching. And if you're unlucky enough to see it, you'd better not look away, because once it notices you, it never leaves, and it's only a matter of time before it knocks on your window.